Hello and welcome to Vintage Super League and our Season 9 semifinals show. I'm Kevin Crone and I'm joined by one of our top 4 competitors tonight, Dr. Rich Shea. Welcome, Rich.
Well, hello, Kevin. Good to see you tonight.
You as well. We've got a lot of great vintage to show tonight and we have several things to discuss before we get to our first match. I'd like to start with the format of tonight's show. We have 4 players tonight, Andreas Peterson, Rachel Agnes, Randy Billier, aforementioned Dr. Shea. Our players will be playing in 2 brackets. Randy and Andreas are up first that we'll be watching, followed by Rachel and Rich. Each pair will play best of 3 matches, yes, matches of vintage goodness. Each player has submitted 2 decks for the evening. They must play 1 deck in match 1 and the other in match 2, and they get to pick the order at game time. And then they can play either deck in match 3 as necessary. Rich, this playoff format presents some interesting and unique metagame challenges. What was your approach?
I thought this was a really interesting setup, and I thought it was actually a really cool design. Wouldn't it be great if we could do a tournament this way?
You're right. There's a lot of interesting nooks and crannies to explore from a deck selection standpoint.
There are. So a lot of decks have some real weaknesses, sort of gaps in where their strengths are. So what I tried to do was pick 2 decks such that no deck would be able to run it over. So let's say that you picked, I don't know, 2 decks that are really heavy into the graveyard, maybe a dredge deck and a survival deck. If your opponent has, say, let's say that she decided to go with a deck that's full of containment priests and ravenous traps and various other things. Well, then I would just get absolutely crushed because Rachel's 1 deck could run over both of mine. And if any deck wins twice, then that deck, that player wins. So if Rachel brought a deck that beat, say, those types of decks, I'd lose to it. So the trick, I think, is to not have any gaps in the armor plating surrounding the turtle that you're building, if that makes sense.
A reasonable strategy, and that apparently led you to Rug Xerox and your Ravager Shops list.
Right.
So can you talk about the salient features of either? I mean, where should we begin?
Sure. So the Xerox list is, so I picked the 2 most stable, consistent, best decks, I think, in the format. I wasn't going for anything fancy. And so the Rug Xerox list is just a very stable, very solid list. It's powerful, it's quick, and I've been really happy with it. The Workshop deck is my exact 60 from Eternal Weekend in the main deck, and I only tuned the sideboard just a little bit. I made it a little better geared toward the decks that I thought would be well suited to play against Xerox, which is to say Dredge, Survival, Eldrazi. But I don't think any of those changes are going to be particularly relevant since Rachel Agnes decided to have 2 photocopy machines, a red, white, and blue one and a rug one.
We know Rachel is given to casting a Monastery Mentor to great success.
Hmm.
Were
That's
you
right. She's put a lot. She's gotten a lot of success out of that one monastery mentor that she's still allowed to have.
what kind of odds did you put on her submitting a Jeskai Xerox deck? 100%?
I
101%?
was at 100% that she would play a red, white, and blue Xerox deck, and I
Yeah.
wasn't quite sure what the other deck would be, but it ended up that she went with the closest thing imaginable.
Her other deck, of course, is a blue-red Pyromancer deck as well. A Rug Pyromancer deck, more specifically, that is just very few cards apart from yours. I mean, you two are within, looks like 2, 3 cards in the main
Three,
deck, maybe.
yeah, I think that in the main deck she added a Mystical Tutor, which I know that your good friend Smenin, Stephen Menendian, is a big fan of.
Definitely.
Um, I can't brook that sort of card disadvantage, but some people are more tolerant than I am, and I applaud that. But the sideboard differs a little bit. She has two Remoras,
I saw that. Pretty
and
interesting. What do you think about that? Does that affect things, do you think, in that mirror?
it might. I mean, I absolutely love Mystic Remora. Now, I don't have enough sideboard space for the mappings that I do. Whenever I'm going to play a deck in a tournament, I go through the list either on paper or in my head to make sure that I have a good swap out. So if I have say 8 dead cards against workshops, I want to make sure that I have 8 reasonable cards on the sideboard to bring in. And after going through that exercise, I didn't really have anything that I could do modulo the one red blast in the sideboard.
Right.
So I didn't have the space to import any fish. But even though it could be very good against me, I'm always happy to see a Remora in action. It's one of my favorite cards. I I love it. You summon this fish, but instead of a creature, somehow it's an enchantment, and it flops around, and you keep giving it more and more water to breathe so it doesn't choke to death. And then eventually you run out of blue mana, and the fish dies.
A fantastic, if extremely literal analogy. Speaking of Mystic Remora, we should devote some energy to talking about our competitors, our first competitors' decks here, Randy and Andreas. And Randy's
Mm,
first deck is Paradoxical Storm, which does
great choice.
include one main deck and one sideboard. Yep, Mystic Remora. Have you
Oh, I
studied
love
Randy's list?
everything about that.
Do you have any observations about its salient features?
Um, I think that you hit the nail on the head with the Remora. Randy has 2 copies of Lavinia in the sideboard, and I think that's really good. But for the most part, it looks like a pretty stock list.
A pretty stock version of the Storm variant, I would argue. Tendrils of
Yeah,
Agony, Time Twister, and Mind's Desire, I would say, being some of the key tent poles of that variant. He has no Key Vault, and he has no extra creatures, just the Monastery Mentor and the Snapcaster Mage that aren't typical.
I like it.
And,
Minimizing wind conditions and just getting more ability to flow through the deck in there like Night Whisper.
hmm
It's
hmm
been a proven strategy.
and of note, his one main deck, Caracas, which has become a bit of a staple in outcome decks now. Maybe not always in the main, but you pretty much can count on people in the Esper variant having access to it now.
I agree. Ever since the outcome decks need a real way to deal with her, otherwise they just don't really function, do they?
Exactly. So then Randy's second list is, as he named it, Jeskai Copy Machine, which is also what I would consider to be a fairly straightforward Jeskai Xerox list, with some of the salient features being 3 Snapcasters and 1 JVP, plus 3 Young Pyromancers. So the
Hmm.
creature base is a little heavier than average. What do you think?
Right, right. Usually the rug decks have 3 Snapcasters and, or sorry, 3 young Pyromancers, and usually the red, white, and blue decks eschew the young Pyromancers entirely. But Randy decided to hedge a little bit and play a build with more creatures in it.
Yeah. And where did he make cuts then? He still has 4 Preordains, and his removal
Ooh,
includes
2 Fluster Storms and 2
3 Lightning
Red
Bolts.
Blasts.
Yeah.
Wow, Randy was really gunning for the mirror here, wasn't he?
Yeah,
He
definitely.
doesn't seem to have the usual main deck artifact removal spell at all.
That's right. That is definitely one of his cuts. There's no main deck Fragmentize or Bifrost or anything similar. He was apparently loading up for expecting Andreas to bring Outcome, which is
Mhm.
another one of those things that I would have put at about 100% if I was putting odds on it. And sure enough, he was paid off. But Andreas brought a variant of Outcome that we haven't really seen much of. He's calling it Sylvan Outcome, and the
Wow.
titular card, Sylvan Library, is there in 2 copies. That's pretty exciting. You've played yourself a number of Sylvan Libraries.
Oh yeah, I have, and I hopefully will cast more of them tonight. So the whole Sylvan outcome, the whole Sylvan, it started with Sylvan Mentor, and that's sort of a Brian Kelly contraption. He's another vintage Super League competitor and a good friend of
Mhm.
mine. And what Brian Kelly figured out is that with all the red blasts and fluster storms that are floating around in the universe of Xerox these days, there's not really a great way to deal with Sylvan Library. So if you can just shove a Sylvan Library onto the battlefield, it's probably going to stick, and you're probably going to get to trade life for cards. And there's not a ton that most of these builds can do about it. So in earlier times, it started when you could play 4 mentors, of course, and it was a great way to dig through your deck and find your mentors, and then find cards to cast with them. But even in our mono mentor universe that we live in now, um, it's still a really effective card. What strikes me, what I think is really exciting about this build from Andreas, is Brain Freeze.
Right. That is a little used storm card in Vintage, and to my eyes, one of the reasons why it's so little used is just because in order to do it proactively on your opponent and have it actually deck them, you need a very high storm count, much higher than the 10 you need for tendrils, or the 2 to 4 that you need for a Mind's Desire to be great. The Brain
Right?
Fees requires a serious commitment, but in my eyes, it has one key powerful advantage, and that is it's something of a trump card in the outcome mirror.
Hmm.
Your
Right.
opponent puts that second outcome onto the stack, and they risk just getting decked right off the bat if their storm, if their turn has progressed in a certain way. And I think that's pretty exciting. I'm actually very keen to see how that one brain feed factors into his match if he ends up playing outcome against outcome for Randy.
I don't know if he's going for an optimal build or if he's going for showmanship, but it's
I
certainly
think
the
I can answer
latter.
that.
Could be the former.
I think I can answer that, Rich, and I would point you to 3 Mana Gorger Hydras in the sideboard. Does that give you the information that you need to make that distinction?
I
Because I
suppose
think it
it
does.
does. I suppose it does. That's a lot of mana gorging that's happening.
Yes, it is. It
Um,
is pretty funny and fun. I like it. I really hope we get into a situation where Mana Gorger Hydra is the right play, because that card is very exciting to watch happen.
he really could use those to trample over Randy's young Pyromancer tokens, couldn't he?
He definitely could.
Randy could think
Definitely.
he's cool with his young Pyromancer tokens, but can't forget about trample.
Yeah, Mana Gorger Hydra is possibly the only thing that grows faster and better than even Monastery Mentor does.
It
And
can,
so, yeah,
and
be
with
very
enough
interesting to
blockers,
see.
it does.
So the fourth deck of the 4 that we'll see in our first set of matches is Andreas's Dredge deck,
Mm,
which is a pitch dredge variant, and it has, and to my eyes, a couple of features that are noteworthy. One is the reanimate creature targets, that is, dread return targets of 2 Kolaghan's command.
wow. Oh,
I'm sorry, 2 Dragon Lord Kolaghan. It would be his
right,
command to kill
right.
your
He's
opponent,
mostly
I
known
guess.
for his command, but
That's right. Little
so
Freudian slip on my part, since I've never cast the Dragon Lord, but his command many times. And 2 Mind Break traps in the main instead of the potential 4. What do you think about this pitch dredge configuration going up against Randy's lists?
it's an interesting variant. It looks a lot like the version that I played or in the season actually, except I had more mind break. I had a third mind break trap, and I think I had the Leylined main over the unmasks, but it looks very similar. The one thing that strikes me is he only has 4 mana sources and four nature's claims. In
Hmm.
my testing, that's not really enough to be a good answer to ley lines.
Yeah, I noticed that as well, and that can put you in some really sticky situations, even from a mulliganing perspective with
Right,
dredge. You could
right.
powder away a mana confluence or 2 and really diminish your capability to fight the Grafdigger's cages that are in Randy's Xerox sideboard, for example.
I agree. I think this is a little more courageous than I might be willing to be. And you'll note that both of my lists had 4 ley lines in the sideboard, so I think I
Hmm.
would have been pretty comfortable facing Andreas on this.
Yeah, I agree completely. It'll be interesting. We'll see if he gets punished for that choice specifically. So let's talk about matchups a little bit. These
All right.
players, another one of the layers to this format for tonight is not just the submission of decks, but the selection of decks at game time.
Right.
If you're either one of these players, how are you evaluating which deck to put first?
That's a great question. So the first deck that you pick, your opponent doesn't know what deck you're on. The second deck you pick, he or she knows which deck you're on. In
Mhm,
other words, you have one bit of information, and your opponent gains that bit for the second match. But
mhm.
then you get that bit of information back for the third match. So, in some ways, I think the right thing to do is to take the deck that requires more specific mulliganing and play it first, unless you expect that your opponent will expect this, in which case you should do it second.
Yep. I think I agree with your conclusion, but obviously it's a leveling game at that point.
It is.
I I think of the 4 decks that we're talking about, Andreas's dredge list meets that definition the most closely, right? So the one that would
I
make it
agree.
the most
And
difficult for Randy,
I think
and, but we don't know.
well, I also think that Dredge has a better chance of tilting Randy for the rest of the night, so I think leading with that makes sense.
Tilt value is a non-zero factor, yes. Well, our players are ready, so let's see how it all shakes out down
All right.